everyone, and welcome back to History with Humility. I'm Erin Miller, founder of Virtue House and professor of History and Ethnic Studies. Before we examine the devastating consequences of disease and ecological transformation, we first need to understand what historians mean by the Columbian Exchange itself. The Columbian Exchange refers to the enormous movement of plants, animals, diseases, people, foods, technologies, and ecological systems between the Eastern and Western Hemispheres after 1492. And importantly, this exchange moved in both directions. From Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Americas came horses, cattle, pigs, wheat, sugarcane, coffee, and devastating diseases such as smallpox and measles. Meanwhile, the Americas introduced crops and products that transformed the wider world: potatoes, maize, tomatoes, cacao, tobacco, beans, and many others. Historians increasingly argue that these exchanges reshaped global history itself. This exchange became possible because, after thousands of years of relative separation, the Eastern and Western Hemispheres were suddenly connected through sustained oceanic travel and imperial expansion. For long periods of time, North and South America had remained geographically isolated from Afro-Eurasia. As a result, many plants, animals, diseases, and immune systems evolved separately, and that separation mattered enormously. Many historians and epidemiologists argue that one reason Eurasian diseases proved so devastating in the Americas was because populations in Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa had experienced centuries of exposure to dense urban environments, large domesticated animal populations, and recurring epidemic diseases. Some scholars connect this to what is sometimes called the long-established Afro-Eurasian urban and trade networks. For long periods of time, many Eurasian populations developed partial immunological resistance to diseases that repeatedly circulated through crowded cities and trade networks. Might also remember that Europeans themselves were hardly immune to epidemic disease. For centuries, Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa experienced devastating outbreaks including plague, smallpox, influenza, and other epidemic diseases. The Black Death alone killed perhaps 1/3 or more of Europe's population during the 14th century, so historians are not arguing that Europeans were somehow biologically invulnerable. Rather, many Eurasian populations had experienced repeated exposure to certain diseases over long periods of time, allowing partial immunological resistance to develop gradually across generations. Meanwhile, many indigenous societies in the Americas had developed in relative geographic isolation from those particular disease systems for thousands of years. Importantly, this does not mean indigenous societies were weak or inferior. In fact, many indigenous civilizations were extraordinarily sophisticated politically, agriculturally, scientifically, and environmentally. Rather, historians argue that different environmental histories produce different disease exposures over very long periods of time. Once these worlds became connected through sustained Atlantic contact, one of the most profound and devastating consequences would emerge through the spread of disease itself. Imagine for a moment a village somewhere in the Americas in the early 16th century. Perhaps news has already begun spreading from neighboring communities. People whisper about strangers arriving from across the ocean and carried on floating wooden structures unlike anything local populations had ever seen before. But the rumors are not only about ships, they are about sickness. Entire villages becoming ill, people developing fevers, strange sores, weakness, death spreading through communities with terrifying speed. In some places, the disease arrives before Europeans themselves, long before soldiers march inland, or missionaries arrive, or colonial governments form. Epidemics are already moving through trade routes, migration paths, and human relationships. Disease traveled faster than conquest. That brings us to one of the most transformative processes in world history, the Columbian Exchange. When historians use the term Columbian Exchange, they are referring to the enormous transfer of plants, animals, diseases, people, foods, technologies, and ecological systems between the Eastern and Western Hemispheres after 1492. And importantly, this exchange moved in both directions. From Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Americas came horses, cattle, pigs, wheat, sugarcane, coffee, and devastating diseases such as smallpox and measles. Meanwhile, the Americas introduced crops and products that transformed the wider world: potatoes, maize, tomatoes, beans, cacao, and tobacco. Historians increasingly argue that these exchanges reshaped global history itself. Charles Mann, in his influential work 1491, discusses one possible factor involving leukocytes, white blood cells connected to immune response. The broader question of why native populations may have been biologically vulnerable to Eurasian diseases. Historians also emphasize that disease vulnerability was not simply biological. War, starvation, forced labor, psychological trauma, ecological collapse, and displacement weakened communities further. Different societies also understood illness differently. Many indigenous communities emphasized caregiving, kinship, and spiritual support for the sick. Families often remained physically close to infected relatives, sharing food, water, living spaces, and caregiving responsibilities. And in societies with no previous experience with diseases such as smallpox, people did not yet understand contagion in the way later germ theory would describe it. So, unlike some later quarantine systems in Europe, many indigenous communities did not isolate infected individuals during the earliest outbreaks. And tragically, it often allowed diseases to spread rapidly through villages, trade routes, and entire regional networks. At the same time, these epidemics often struck repeatedly. A community weakened by one outbreak might then face famine, warfare, social disruption, forced labor demands, or another epidemic shortly afterward. So historians increasingly emphasize that mortality came not from one isolated event, but from cascading waves of disease and disruption over generations. And the transformation of indigenous societies did not stop with disease alone. The Columbian Exchange also reshaped landscapes, animals, food systems, and entire ecological relationships across the Americas. And the devastation was not limited to human populations. Historian Alfred Crosby famously used the phrase ecological imperialism to describe how European expansion transformed entire ecosystems. Europeans brought cattle, horses, pigs, weeds, wheat, and agricultural systems that dramatically reshaped American environments. Sometimes the consequences were surprisingly interconnected. Buffalo and indigenous land use systems had co-evolved with North American grasslands over very long periods of time. Buffalo grazing patterns often left upper grass layers relatively intact, allowing many grasslands to regenerate naturally. European cattle often grazed much closer to the ground, disrupting those ecological balances more aggressively. Meanwhile, European wheat seeds spread through animal waste across disturbed landscapes. Gradually, European grasses and agricultural systems displaced many indigenous ecological patterns. These changes affected far more than food supply. For many indigenous societies, animals, landscapes, migration cycles, and agriculture were deeply connected to systems of belief, oral tradition, community identity, and sacred knowledge. Remember, many indigenous societies transmitted knowledge orally. Knowledge was embedded in relationships between people, animals, seasons, landscapes, rituals, and sacred geography. Ecological devastation did not simply destroy bodies. It often destabilized systems of memory, identity, belief, and cultural continuity itself. And this reminds us why historians must approach the past carefully and humbly. The world Europeans encountered in the 16th century was not a timeless wilderness. It was a world already experiencing extraordinary transformation, adaptation, and trauma. And when historians study these enormous transformations, they are ultimately trying to explain how multiple systems interacted together to reshape human history. And importantly, historians increasingly argue that conquest cannot be understood only through guns and battles. Disease, ecology, animals, plants, environmental transformation were central actors in this history as well. One of the most important skills historians practice is causation, explaining why historical events happen. And as we've seen today, large historical transformations rarely emerge from a single cause. Conquest and colonization involved, military conflict, disease, ecology, trade, religion, labor systems, environmental change, human decision-making all interacting together. Historians also reconstruct the past using many different forms of evidence: archaeology, written records, oral traditions, biology, ecology, and demographic modeling. History is not simply memorizing facts. It is an ongoing process of investigation, interpretation, evidence-based reconstruction. And that reminder that human societies are deeply interconnected with environment, disease, belief, and one another remains one of the most important lessons of the Columbian Exchange.